Kia ora te iwi and welcome to The Chew, coming at you from the studio here in Kaimuriwai, Arrowtown. Ko Arrowtown Dad tēnei. And for this week's chew, we are changing it up a little bit. So I've decided to do a quick chew on our podcast setup. So this week's episode will be about the hardware setup of this podcast and how we made the decisions around which pieces of hardware to use and for what reasons, etc. Most of the reasoning behind the hardware selections would be probably cost. Yeah, so let's get started. So before I start on the hardware aspects of this podcast, I'll just touch on the actual podcast itself and the genesis of it, I guess you could say. So the first question to ask is why? Why do a podcast? So this goes back a few years now, but I guess the why, to answer the why, it was because living here in Queenstown, you meet so many interesting people from different walks of life. Most people who live here have moved here from out of district, and generally speaking, I find that people who live in this region have very much an entrepreneurial spirit. So they're very interesting in what they do. They're so busy on a day-to-day basis. Like every day is different, typically, to people who live in this region. So for that reason, I thought it'd be interesting to capture some of the stories of people who have moved here. On top of that, I guess we sort of pushed a bit of a niche as well, and that niche is to sort of focus on Māori content as well. So one of the things I was keen to do was to hear the Māori voices in this region. There's this misconception that Queenstown doesn't have many Māori people living here. And I guess if you compare it to other major cities, that's probably correct. But there's certainly more than people realise. So part of the reason I wanted to create this podcast is to capture those Māori stories. Yeah. Now, the name, The Chew, well, I can't actually remember where I got the name The Chew from, but what I remembered is that I wanted a simple, easy to understand name for the podcast without being too fancy, without being too, I don't know, smart about a really complicated name for the podcast. So I settled on The Chew. Hopefully most people can realise the reference to the chew, meaning chewing the fat, which sort of goes into the idea of the podcast format. So the podcast format is very much an interview style. However, we didn't go in with the intention of only making it a interview style. That was just one aspect that we really wanted to push. The other aspect to the podcast would be to just chew the fat. Just for me and whoever the co-host would be, we would just talk about interesting subjects relative to either the Māori world or to the local Queenstown region as well. So that's sort of where we came from when first creating this podcast, The Chew. And another important aspect of The Chew was to sort of decide where we were going to film it. Now, we had a couple of misstarts with trying to find locations around Queenstown. And in the end, I actually found it simpler, much easier to set up a studio here at home. So here in my house, one of the spare bedrooms, I've converted into something of a studio for The Chew. So it certainly makes the hardware aspect of things easier because I can statically set up all the hardware in one location and make it easier to sort of to recycle episodes. So that was another key factor in deciding how we're going to run the podcast. One of the other ones, probably one of the most important ones, and this is a rule that we never really got to stick to, which is how long to make a podcast. Now, the general train of thought is that you should keep it somewhat short. between 15 to 30 minutes long at the maximum. But what we found with the interview process was people were so interesting in their personal lives that I was fine for some of our interviews to go over 1 hour, to go over an hour and a half sometimes, because they were so interesting. And I thought, the main reason for doing this is to capture the stories. It's not so much to gain viewership. That's just a bonus. So, we kind of didn't really care whether some of our interview ones in particular went too long. It might be hard for the listener to sit there for an hour and a half or 2 hours to go through, an interview, but at least we captured those stories. That was the main point for me. So now we get to the actual technical. So let me get started on all of the technical pieces that make up what is the Tube podcast. Here we go. So the first decision to make, I felt was the correct decision to make, is to focus your energies on the most important piece of hardware for a podcast. And for me, that would be the microphones. So it was really important for me to find microphones that were going to be somewhat higher quality, but without breaking the bank. And way back in the start, when I was doing some research on it, there was some other key aspects that I found was sort of where I wanted to go with the hardware. The first is to choose a dynamic mic with a cardioid pattern. And dynamic mic means they're the type of mics that are not overly sensitive. So what that means is they don't pick up lots of external noise. And the cardioid pattern as well means that it captures more of the front in front of the microphone. So that was a key decision that I made early, was they had to be dynamic and preferably with a cardioid pattern. So there are two particular types of dynamic mic that I use. The first one is a Audio-Technica ATR 2100 USB. Now this mic was the first mic that I ever bought, and this is going back quite a few years, so for the price point this is a really good mic. It has a couple of key advantages where it offers a USB connection, so you can plug directly into a computer, and it also has an XLR connection. So you've got the two options for connection there. In the early days, I thought the USB would be the preferred method of connection, but since I've been doing this a little while now, I've changed my train of thought, and I certainly go with the XLR option these days, and we'll get onto that a little bit later as to why. I used to have two of these mics, but when Taika moved north, he accidentally took my other Audio-Technica mic with him. So that ended up being a really good thing for me, because I needed to go out and buy another microphone. And after doing a little bit of research and sort of looking at the cost effectiveness as well, I settled on this particular mic right here. Now this mic right here is called a Rode Pod mic, and as the name suggests, pod mic, it's an ideal microphone for podcasting. Actually, this is easily my favorite microphone. Really good sound quality, heavy duty, and it's just an all-round really good mic. It's a little bit pricier than the average mic, but totally worth it. One downside to this mic is that it has only an XLR connection, doesn't have USB, but for my hardware setup, that's not a problem at all. I don't actually use the USB on mine anymore. So, and some of the other components that I have in my hardware setup, you'll see why. Now, for both of these mics, I also use a foam windshield. Now, although I don't really interview outdoors or outside where, the shielding of wind might be important, I do suffer from this other problem where I really enunciate my T sounds, and I also enunciate my CH sounds as well. So These windshields are actually really good at dampening down that harshness when you're recording the sound. Also in the studio here, I use these boom arms to hold on to the mics for both me, the interviewer, and the person I'm interviewing. I have 2 separate boom arms. I also have microphone stands if I need them, and it's probably worth getting microphone stands if you plan on being mobile a little bit more. But because I have a static office and a static studio where I do my interviews, it's easier for me to just set up some boom arms to hold microphones, so everything is set in place and I never have to move it. Now you'll notice that I don't use headphones when I do this podcast. I just found that they're really uncomfortable and I don't actually see the benefit in using headphones. So I guess the reason most people use headphones is they can listen to the sound level and do adjustments on the fly. But for me, I worry about that in the post-production, and so I can handle that through the editing. So I don't have any need to wear headphones for my podcast. Now, another important part of your recording hardware is your device that you use to do the recording, or the interface. There are really good options for all-in-one sound recorders. Examples are the Zoom PodTrack P4, where it has 4 different XLR inputs, so you can record up to 4 different microphones or different types of input. It records within the unit itself, and then you would transfer those tracks to a computer when it's time to do your post-processing. Now, I don't have any of that. I'm probably going to eventually buy one of those, I think, if I feel I really have a need to use that. It seems to be a better option, especially if you're looking at doing mobile interviewing. Now, in the early days, I already had a mixer for mixing a mic and a guitar, and so I used this mixer for my early podcasts. So this particular mixer is a Mackie 402 VLZ4. It has 4 channels with Onyx preamps as well. It accepts 2 XLR mic inputs, and so I would plug in both of my microphones into each of those XLR plugs. There you can also see there are gain options. There is also equalizer options, and of course a level adjustment as well. So when it comes time to do the recording, I would plug RCA plugs into the tape out left and right, and at the other end I would plug into an auxiliary input on a computer, in my case on my main desktop computer. Now, one of the downsides to using this mixer is that both mics are being mixed and then combined into a single track, which made it really tricky when one mic level was lower than the other. So to get over that problem, I purchased this basic audio interface. It is a Behringer UMC 202 HD. What I would call a downside to this particular unit is that it only accepts the 2 XLR mic inputs, and that's fine if you plan on doing all of your interviews with just 2 people. On this particular unit, you've got all your standard adjustments, including headphone jack with an adjustment for that as well if you want to use it. At the back, there is a USB connector which allows you to plug straight into the USB port of your PC or laptop, which then allows easy recording through your favorite recording application. Finally, because the podcast channel is also a YouTube channel, I also record and edit video for each episode of the podcast. Of all the hardware used for this podcast, the video equipment is the one that I've spent the least on, because the video quality is something that I have less focus on with this particular podcast channel. So with that being said, here is what I use to do my video recording. The main front-facing video source that I use is my everyday phone. It's an Oppo X3. It's a standard phone with most of the usual features. However, the main reason that I like this phone is that it has this cool advanced feature where it allows you to record the front and the rear cameras at the same time. So obviously you can see the benefit in using this type of video device for podcasting. And now if I'm not doing an interview podcast, I can also switch the camera to record with better features, which in this case is 1080 resolution at 60 frames per second. This camera does support 4K, but only at 30 frames per second. So for me, it's an easy choice to switch to 1080 just so that I can get the 60 frames per second. Because it's a fairly newer phone, I can record for as long as I have free space on the phone for, which is literally hours. So if you have a fairly recent phone, check to see if you have the same advanced feature of recording both the front and rear camera at the same time. You might be ready to start recording your own podcast. Now that's my main video source, but I like to have a secondary video source as well that records like a panned out video of the same situation. So I have the second angle of video recording for a really good reason. During post-production or the editing process, if I need to cut pieces out of my recorded footage, it looks weird when, as a viewer, you see these glitchy pieces where something has obviously been edited. But with a second recorded angle, what you can do is you can switch to that other angle at the moment that you do a cut, so that it's not obvious to the viewer that a cut has actually happened. Just a little tip that I picked up along the way. And the video source that I use here for the second video recording is, once again, just another old phone that I no longer use, and this is a Oppo A73. Nothing flash about it at all. It can record at either 720 or at 1080 for a maximum of 2 gigabytes. Now that's one of the downsides of using this old phone, is when it reaches its 2 gigabyte recording limit, it just stops. So if I record in 720, I usually get about an hour's worth of recording for 2 gigabytes. And if I record at 1080, then I get about a half an hour of recording. Sometime in the future, I'll probably go out and buy a decent video source, either another phone or a dedicated camera. Finally, from a hardware perspective, the last and probably most important piece of hardware that I need to join all of this together is a PC. Now, this old antiquated thing has been my home PC for the past 12 years. It's still going strong and there's no need to replace it yet. It's an 8-core i7 with 24 gig of RAM, 500 gigabytes of SSD storage, and I have about 4 terabytes of hard drive storage as well. Although it's an old system, it's still fairly powerful even by today's standards. But honestly, you could run a podcast off any off-the-shelf PC. It doesn't have to be overly powerful, it just has to run a couple of software packages really well. So there are all the hardware components that I use for this particular podcast. I hope that answers all the questions that you may have. Just be aware there's many options for hardware that you can use for podcasting. This is just one version of a combination. Really, what you decide to purchase will come down to how much you're willing to spend and what's important to you as well. My recommendation is, if you're going to spend any money on anything, then make it on your microphones or your sound recording devices. So there you are. There's the hardware setup for this podcast, The Chew. If you have any questions about anything I've discussed, pop them down in the chat box below. Remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time on The Chew. Mā te wā.